The mirror arrived on a Wednesday lashed by storms, swaddled in damp rags that reeked of forgotten cellar and rotting brine. Edward, my old college friend from Providence, appeared at my door beneath a downpour that turned the suburban streets into murky rivers. He looked aged 10 years, his eyes sunken, his hands trembling as he handed me that heavy, unnaturally cold object, even through the cloth. He didn't explain its origin, only rasped in a voice I barely recognized that he needed rid of it, that he couldn't stand the whispers in the walls of his tiny Salem apartment anymore. Before I could question him, he vanished into the curtain of rain, leaving me alone with that sinister package and a chill not born of the weather. Installed in my study, a room lined with old books and archaeological relics of dubious provenance I collected, the mirror revealed itself as disguised monstrosity. The frame was dark wood, almost black, carved with patterns that seemed to writhe under a fixed gaze, shapes like tentacles strangling roots or abyssal creatures swallowing stars. The glass, thick and heavy, wasn't silvered, but a surface sickly green and milky, like ice over stagnant water. The worst was the stain. A large, oily black tear running from near the top of the frame almost to the center, like an open wound in the world. It didn't reflect the lamplight cleanly, swallowing it with avidity, leaving the corner of the study darker than it should be. The first days were morbid observation. I sat before it, trying to decipher its secrets, its origin. My own reflection was an affront. The image showed a pale face, yes, but with contours slightly blurred, as seen through smoke. The eyes seemed deeper, darker, and there was a persistent shadow behind me in the reflection, corresponding to nothing in my real study. A shadow that sometimes seemed to breathe. I ignored the shivers, attributing them to fatigue, to an imagination fueled by Edward's stories. But the cold persisted around the object, a damp chill permeating the air. It was on a silent night, only the ticking of the wall clock breaking the vacuum, that the distortion manifested undeniably. I looked into the mirror, as usual, and my reflection wasn't alone. To my left, in the upper left corner of the glass, a figure crouched. It wasn't human. It was a formless mass of deep shadows, pulsing, with fragments that could be eyes, or mouths, or twisted limbs, glowing with a sickly greenish phosphorescence, the same hue as the glass. It had no defined shape, only an agony of contours defying logic, a non-Euclidean geometry that made my mind stumble. Terror was an ice dagger plunged into my chest. I froze, unable to look away. The thing didn't move relative to the frame, seeming to float in the distorted space of the reflection, but I felt, with visceral certainty, that it saw me, that it studied me. From then on, the reality in the mirror deteriorated rapidly. My reflection became increasingly grotesque. The skin took on a cadaverous tone, the eyes sank until they became black pits, and a wide smile, devoid of any joy, slowly tore across a face that was no longer mine. The shadow behind me in the reflection solidified, becoming a constant presence, a silhouette too tall and thin, with angular shoulders and a head like a deformed bulb. The reflected environment also changed. My study, once recognizable, became a decayed version, walls peeling to reveal black bricks, furniture covered in a kind of phosphorescent slime, and, through the reflected window, there was no street, but a night sky infested with pulsing stars in wrong colors, sickly reds and greens, and a huge, cracked moon oozing a viscous yellow light. The black stain, that oily wound, seemed to pulse in sync with the distorted stars. The worst were the other inhabitants. Figures crawled at the edges of the reflection, shapes writhing in the slime on the walls, creatures with multiple limbs articulated unnaturally, or pulsating blobs of flesh. They were fleeting visions, but sharp enough to make me gasp and recoil from the cursed surface. The cold around the mirror intensified, becoming physical, an icy wind emanating from the glass itself, even with the window closed. A penetrating smell invaded the study, a nauseating mix of stagnant water, rotting flesh, and something metallic, like old blood. The whispers began, not audible in the air, but inside my head, a constant murmur, unintelligible, made of torn voices and grinding sounds, seeming to emanate from the direction of the mirror. They stole my sleep, my sanity. The shadow entity, the one always behind my distorted reflection, began to take prominence. It stood motionless for long periods, its bulbous head tilted slightly, watching me. I felt its gaze as a physical weight, a pressure on my neck even with my back to the mirror. One night, as I forced myself to look at that aberration, trying to understand, it moved. It didn't walk, but seemed to slide closer to my decayed reflection. It extended a hand, or what resembled a hand, a long appendage ending in fine claws black as obsidian. It touched the shoulder of the thing that was my reflection in the glass. At that instant, a sharp pain, like an ice claw, tore through my right shoulder in real life. I cried out, raised my hand, and saw in the mirror my distorted reflection raise its corresponding hand, but with an even wider, crueler smile, while the shadow kept its claw upon him. The line between worlds was fraying. The pressure increased. The whisper became a chorus of agonized voices inside my skull. The apparitions in the mirror became more frequent, more aggressive. The creatures approached, touching the glass surface from their side, leaving viscous marks that seemed to burn the glass. I felt a physical attraction to the object, a magnetic pull dragging my eyes to that window into hell, even as I desperately tried to avoid looking. My reflection was now unrecognizable, a hideous parody, and the shadow was always glued to it, like a possessive owner. The cold was unbearable, the smell unbearable, the terror constant. The final night began like the others, but with an abnormal quietness, a silence heavy as lead. The ticking of the clock ceased. Even the whispers in my mind silenced, replaced by a high-pitched, deafening whine. I felt compelled to approach the mirror. The black stain pulsed violently, like a dying heart. My monstrous reflection was still, the smile frozen in a rictus of pure malignant ecstasy. The shadow behind it was more solid, more real than ever. Its eyes, if they were eyes, two deep slits in the darkness of its head, glowed with their own light, a putrid green color reminiscent of deep-sea luminescence. Then, the glass surface ceased reflecting. It became a door. A doorway opened to that nightmare reality. I saw the decayed study, the glowing slime, the shapes writhing in the shadows, the cracked moon in the wrong sky. And the shadow extended its claw, not towards the reflection, but towards me, through the glass. It wasn't a reflection. It was a real hand, black, cold as the vacuum of space, emerging from the milky, greenish surface, tearing through the barrier like rotten fabric. The fine, sharp claws glinted under the weak light of my lamp. The air cracked with a sound that wasn't sound, a vibration making my bones tremble. The smell of rot and blood exploded, suffocating. Absolute panic seized me. I tried to recoil, to scream, but my voice died in my throat. My legs wouldn't respond. The claw closed around my arm. The touch was a profanation, a sensation of pure entropy, of life being sucked away. It was stronger than any human force. I was pulled forward, towards the portal opened in the mirror. I saw, in one last flash of terrified lucidity, the shadow entity emerging, flowing through the opening like thick, black smoke, occupying the space of my study. Its green eyes fixed on me with an ancient hunger. The impact against the glass surface wasn't of breaking glass. It was like plunging into viscous, freezing jelly, followed by the horrible sensation of being stretched, unmade, and remade in another geometry. Excruciating pain, not physical, but existential, tore through every particle of my being. The world around me, my world, disintegrated into fragments of light and shadow. I fell through absolute darkness, punctuated only by those sick, pulsing stars, hearing the triumphant shrieks of the things inhabiting that place, shrieks that now became part of the deafening roar in my own skull. When the sensation of falling ceased, I was standing. But not in my study. I was in the decayed study, facing the mirror, which now reflected a normal, peaceful, familiar scene. It was my study, the real one, lit by the lamp. And before my bookshelf, back turned to me, stood a figure. It was me. Or something that looked exactly like me, wearing my clothes, with my mannerisms. It turned, and its eyes were pits of absolute darkness, with only a tiny point of putrid green light at the center, like a distant echo of the entity. It smiled, a calm, ordinary smile, but it didn't reach those empty eyes. It raised a hand in a casual gesture of greeting, a perfect human hand. Through the reflected window, I saw the quiet Providence Street under a normal night. I felt then, not with my ears, but in the essence of what remained of me, the first notes of the whisper. It was its voice, the imposter's voice, calm, almost friendly, starting to talk to someone it couldn't see. The sound leaked through the glass, a common, mundane sound, but to me, it was the sound of my world being stolen. And worse, I felt the other presences on this side, in this nightmare of slimy walls and cracked sky, approaching silently behind me, drawn by my fresh terror, the smell of my torn soul. The door was open, and I was on the wrong side, trapped forever in that distorted reflection, while something wearing my skin, with my mannerisms and my voice, but with those black eyes and the point of green light, began to live my life, to touch the people I knew, to walk the streets of the city I called home. And the mirror, now a common window into a hell disguised as normality, awaited its next curious victim. The whisper of my impostor grew clearer, addressing someone on the other side, someone approaching the study door, with a voice I knew well. It was my sister, Anne's voice, asking if everything was all right. And the thing with my black eyes answered, with perfect naturalness, that yes, it was just admiring the old mirror. I woke at 3:47 a.m. with my heart drumming like a war machine inside my chest, hands clawing the sheets like they were my only anchor in a raging sea. It wasn't a normal nightmare. The smell woke me first. Wet earth, rotting leaves at the bottom of a dank pit, and something else, something metallic, like old blood drying on wood. Then, as if a switch flipped, I saw the shadow pressed against the bedroom wall near the window. Not the vague outline of a tree swaying in the wind outside. A tall figure, impossibly thin, with a head that seemed grotesquely elongated, tilted at an impossible angle. It stood there, motionless, watching. I knew, with a cold, deep certainty, it was watching me, even without discernible eyes. That was 3 months ago, exactly 1 week after the accident on I-95 near Portland, Maine, that took my wife, Mary Ann. I survived. The car flipped. I slid through shattered glass like a fish through a torn net, but Mary Ann was trapped. The fire started fast. The smell of gasoline, the blistering heat, her screams. Those screams still echo in my bones, more real than any sound in the waking world. It was after the doctors released me from the hospital in Hartford, after I returned to the empty apartment in Boston, that things truly began to crumble, or rather, to fuse. Dreams stopped being dreams, and reality stopped being reliable. In the hospital, doped on painkillers with my arm in a cast, I saw things. Dark shapes shifting in the corners of the high ceiling, heard whispers drifting from the empty hallway, always at night. I blamed the meds, the trauma, the unbearable ache of loss. The psychiatrist, a kind man named Dr. Raymond, with tired eyes and a salt and pepper mustache, agreed. PTSD, insomnia, possible hypnagogic hallucinations. He prescribed sleep aids, anti-anxiety meds, encouraged therapy. I took the pills religiously, but instead of helping, they seemed to lubricate the doors between worlds. The dreams became too vivid, too cruel. I dreamed repeatedly of the accident, but with new, horrifying details. Marianne wasn't just screaming, trapped. She was screaming as a dark force, a presence with long, thin limbs, pulled her back into the burning car. I dreamed of endless corridors within my own apartment, chased by a presence that breathed with a wet, rasping sound, always behind me, always closing in, no matter how fast I ran. And the worst part, I'd wake to the same smell of rotting earth and blood in the room. And sometimes, just sometimes, I'd catch the outline of that tall, thin figure, always in my peripheral vision, vanishing when I jerked my head around. Dr. Raymond increased the dose. My brother, Peter, who lives in Providence, started coming every day after work. He tried to help, cooked, cleaned, tried to drag me for walks around the block. Peter was always the practical one, feet firmly on the ground. He saw my deterioration, the tremor in my hands, the deep hollows under my eyes, my gaze constantly darting to scan the corners. "Luke, you need real rest," he'd say, his voice thick with a worry bordering on desperation. "This is guilt, grief. It's eating you alive." I wanted to believe him. God, how I wanted to. But how could I explain that the entity from my dreams now walked beside me on the street, under the harsh sunlight? I didn't see it fully, of course. It was a blur of dark movement at the edge of my sight when I looked away, a strange, elongated reflection in a store window that vanished when I stared. But I felt it. A cold pressure between my shoulder blades, a weight in the air that made breathing difficult, like being submerged. And the smell. Always the smell. Peter never sensed it. "That's just the dumpster over there, Luke," he'd say, pointing to a distant bin, while I swallowed back the bile rising in my throat. The boundaries dissolved like wet paper. One night, after a particularly bad day where the figure felt more present, more tangible, almost a step behind me in the grocery store, I took the sleeping pill early. I crashed into a heavy, oppressive sleep. I dreamed I was in the apartment, but everything was wrong. The walls sweated a black, sticky substance. The floor undulated like stagnant water. And the entity was there. No longer a fleeting shadow, but a palpable thing made of darkness denser than night, with that elongated head and 2 points of putrid green light where eyes should be. It came towards me, moving with a sinuous wrongness, its long fingers ending in sharp points reaching out. The terror was so absolute it jolted me awake, sitting bolt upright in bed, drenched in cold sweat. My heart hammered. I took deep breaths, trying to convince myself it was just a dream, just another horrible nightmare. I looked at the alarm clock on the nightstand. 3:47 a.m. The same time as the first visitation. Then the smell hit me, stronger than ever. Rotting earth, blood, and something chemical like burning. My blood turned to ice. I wasn't alone. Slowly, forcing every muscle to obey, I turned my head to the left, towards the bedroom window. It was there. Not a glimpse, not a fleeting shadow. The entity, as real as the bed I sat on. Leaning against the wall beside the window, its elongated head tilted, those green points fixed on me. The weak streetlight filtered through the window, but didn't touch the figure. It was a void, an absence of light. I could see the texture of the wall behind it. It was solid. A choked gasp escaped my throat. This wasn't a dream. It couldn't be. The terror was physical, a silent scream in every cell. I froze, trapped in that green, soulless gaze. It didn't move. It just watched. My hand, trembling violently, fumbled for the switch on the bedside lamp. I clicked it. Yellow light flooded the room. The wall was empty. Nothing. Just the slightly cracked paint texture, the shadow cast by the dresser. The smell lingered, strong, nauseating. I looked frantically around. Nothing. My whole body shook. I got up, staggering, and turned on every light in the apartment, one by one. I checked behind doors, inside the closet, under the bed. Nothing. Just the echo of my hurried footsteps and the furious pounding of my heart. But the smell wouldn't fade, and the feeling of being watched was a lead weight on my shoulders. I stayed awake the rest of the night, huddled on the living room sofa with every light blazing, gripping a kitchen knife so hard my knuckles turned white. Reality, as I knew it, had shattered. I no longer knew where the nightmare ended and the world began. The days that followed were a waking nightmare. The entity didn't appear so visibly again, but its presence was constant. A flicker of movement in the periphery while I washed dishes. A strange, elongated reflection in the bathroom mirror while I brushed my teeth, gone when I blinked. The smell, always the smell, appearing out of nowhere. In the elevator, in the office where I tried to work remotely, in the middle of the street. Exhaustion was a second skin, heavy and poisoned. The pills stopped working, or maybe made things worse. I stopped taking them. Dr. Raymond grew worried. Peter grew frantic. "Luke, you look like a ghost," he said, his voice ragged. "You need help." Impatient, maybe. This isn't normal. I knew he was right, but the fear was greater. Fear of what they'd do with me. Fear that, locked away somewhere, the entity could reach me easier. And fear of what it might do if I wasn't vigilant. Insomnia became absolute. The fear of sleep, of plunging back into that realm where the entity was undeniably real and powerful, outweighed any exhaustion. When sleep finally claimed me, it was only to fall into brief, fragmented nightmares, waking up screaming minutes later, drenched in cold sweat, my heart threatening to burst. I started avoiding mirrors. My own reflection frightened me. Hollow, wild eyes, pale, clammy skin, the expression of a man on the edge of the abyss. The entity seemed to feed on my fear, my confusion. The feeling of pursuit intensified. Not just the figure, but sounds. Dragging footsteps in the apartment hallway when I knew I was alone. Soft knocks on the walls, coming from nowhere. A low, unintelligible whisper, like dry leaves scraped over concrete, seeming to come from inside my own ears. The real world seemed faded, colorless, scentless, just a backdrop for my private agony. The line between awake and dreaming vanished completely. Everything was a terrifying vigil, a constant state of alert where the enemy could strike from any dimension. The breaking point was the clock, or rather, its absence. After a particularly horrific night, dreaming the entity was sitting on my bed, its bony fingers touching my face with tomb coldness, I woke at dawn, exhausted to the marrow. I went to the kitchen to make coffee, movements slow and mechanical. I passed the nightstand. Something was wrong. I stopped, looked. The digital alarm clock, the one that always read 3:47 during my episodes, was dark. The screen was completely black. It wasn't unplugged. It was destroyed. The plastic casing was cracked as if crushed by a huge hand, the buttons shattered, the display smashed inside, smeared with something dark and dried that looked like old blood. But there was no blood on the nightstand. No sign of a struggle. No sign of anything. Just that shattered clock, like a silent, brutal warning. That's when I saw the marks on the hardwood floor near the bedroom window. Not clear footprints. Dark smudges, like something wet and filthy had been dragged. Smudges that formed a trail leading from the window, right to my bed. The window was closed, but unlocked from the inside. A cold unrelated to temperature crawled down my spine. It had been there. It wasn't a dream. It had been there, in my reality, touching the clock, walking through my room while I slept, or pretended to sleep. Despair was a silent scream inside my chest. This wasn't madness. It was real. As real as the wood beneath my feet. The entity wasn't just in my dreams. It was here, and it could touch things. It could touch me. Peter found me hours later, still sitting on the bedroom floor, staring at the destroyed clock, eyes dry but wide with pure terror. He didn't see the marks on the floor. They'd vanished, evaporated as if never there. But the clock was there, broken. He tried to calm me, speaking softly, saying I must have knocked it over in my sleep, that it was okay. But I saw it in his eyes, behind the concern, a new fear. Fear of me. Fear of what I might do. He insisted on staying the night. I didn't fight. I was beyond fighting. I sat on the sofa, staring at the blank wall, feeling every shadow lengthen, every creak of the building become a threatening whisper. I knew it was there, somewhere, watching, waiting. Sleep was the enemy. Wakefulness was torture. There was no escape. The entity had crossed the last boundary, and now inhabited my world fully, an invisible predator toying with its cornered prey. The apartment, once a refuge, was now a prison with useless doors and windows. The only certainty was the smell of rotting earth and blood, and those 2 points of putrid green light, which I knew, with a conviction that drove me towards madness, were fixed on me, even when I couldn't see them. The Shadow Watcher never slept, and I, Luke, was wide awake, trapped forever within its gaze. The water of Shadow Lake, near Bar Harbor, Maine, never felt natural. Even under the fierce August sun, it maintained an oily opacity, a green-black so profound it swallowed light, reflecting only distorted fragments of sky and the dense pine forests that choked its shores. It was this strange water, this stillness too heavy to be peace, that led me to accept Carl's invitation to camp on that isolated beach, known only to local fishermen and fools. Now, sitting alone on the cold sand under a moon that seems too small and distant, with the echo of screams still hammering my eardrums and the stench of silt and something indescribably ancient clinging to my clothes, I know I've committed a cosmic error. The lake's tranquility was a lie, a thin veil over a reality as old as it is monstrous, and we paid the most terrible price for tearing it aside. We were 5. Me, Frank, ever the skeptic, the journalist chasing a harmless folktale about strange lights on the lake. Carl, my old friend, the tireless adventurer, organizer of this misadventure, with his unshakable faith in logic and a good campfire. Isabel, his girlfriend, a sensitive artist whose eyes caught nuances ours missed. She seemed the only one truly unsettled by the place from the start. Luke, Carl's younger brother, a carefree college student and horror enthusiast who thought it was totally badass. And Sophia, my partner, pragmatic and brave, whose smile was my anchor. We arrived at dusk, golden light staining the still water a sickly amber. We pitched tents back from the shore, in a small sandy clearing pressed upon by the suffocating green wall of the forest. The silence was the first warning. Not the silence of nature, alive with whispers, but a vacuum. No bird song, no insect hum, only the occasional snap of a dry branch in the dense woods, sounding like breaking bones. Isabel mentioned the smell, a faint odor of rotting fish and decaying vegetation, stronger near the water, but Carl blamed lakebed sediment. The first night was tense. The campfire crackled, casting grotesque shadow dances on the pines. Luke told local ghost stories, of a drowned village whose church bells still tolled on full moons. Carl laughed, but I saw Isabel shrink, her dark eyes fixed on the lake's black surface just yards away. She whispered she'd seen something break the water, something large and dark but smooth, like a rock sinking too fast. No one else saw. We dismissed it as a big fish or log. Sleep was fitful. I woke near midnight with the vivid sensation of being watched by something lurking in the lake. A pressure on my chest, a coldness not from the air. I peered through the tent flap. The moon, pale and small, painted a trembling path of light on the motionless water. Nothing moved. But the silence was now active, intensely watchful. as if the night itself held its breath. The next day brought false normalcy. The high sun burned off some low mist clinging to the lake, but couldn't penetrate its green-black depths. We decided to explore by boat, an old rowboat Carl had brought. The water was unnaturally cold, even under the sun. We rowed, the sound of oars hitting water obscenely loud in the oppressive quiet. It was in the lake's center, where the water was darkest, nearly black, that Sophia pointed. Bubbles rose to the surface, large, slow, as if something immense was exhaling below. Then, shapes. Vague, indistinct forms moving in the depths, far below. Not fish. Too big, shifting with a deliberate, sinuous slowness. A sense of primordial dread, a fear rooted not in reason but in some deep, slumbering instinct, gripped me. Carl tried to laugh, calling them giant catfish, but his voice sounded false, strained. Isabel went pale, her fingers gripping the boat's edge white-knuckled. It was when Luke, leaning too far over the side, almost hypnotized by the shapes below, yelled. Something long, pale, and slick, tentacle-like but covered in irregular scales and tiny, unblinking eyes, broke the water for a fleeting instant. A flash of diseased flesh, and brushed his arm. He recoiled, scrubbing the spot in disgust, swearing he felt a wet, repulsive cold. No one else saw it clearly, just a blur, an anomalous ripple. The mood shifted. The game was over. We rowed back in silence, tension thick enough to choke on. The lake felt less like scenery and more like a living entity, aware of our intrusion. Night fell like a tombstone. The campfire seemed small, insignificant, against the absolute darkness swallowing forest and lake. That active, watchful silence returned, heavier than before. Isabel was visibly shaken, huddled near the fire, her eyes darting constantly to the shadows and the lake. She murmured about sounds, whispers coming from the water, drowned, senseless voices that seemed to call her name. Carl tried to comfort her, but his own face was tight. Luke, normally chatty, was quiet, staring fixedly at where the tentacle touched him. His arm now showing a faint irritation, a strange redness that seemed to pulse. It was during watch that terror became real. We took shifts. Sophia and I were awake, sitting by the fire struggling against the damp cold. Isabel rested in her tent, Carl slept in his, Luke tossed restlessly in his. Suddenly, a scream, piercing, pure terror, ripped through the night. It was Isabel. We sprinted toward her tent, flashlight beams cutting the darkness like dull knives. The tent was open, empty. Her sleeping bag, tossed aside. And footprints. Not human. Wide, wet impressions. 3 long webbed toes dragging from the tent straight toward the lake. We followed the tracks, hearts pounding like mad drums, flashlight beams trembling. They led right into the water, vanishing at the dark edge. Carl woke to the scream, Luke too. Together, 4 frantic souls with flashlights, we searched the shore, calling Isabel's name. Nothing. Only the black, motionless water reflecting our lights like dead eyes. Carl's despair was physical. He wanted to plunge in, dive after her, but we held him back. The water felt colder, thicker, more hostile. It was when Luke, shining his light near the water's edge, groaned. Partially submerged, tangled in black, slimy weeds, was Isabel's sweater, and clutched on it, visible for an instant before vanishing into the depths, something that froze my blood. A hand, but not human. Long, skeletal, with skin pale and translucent like a deep-sea fish, ending in curved claws black as obsidian. The horror was so absolute it paralyzed us. Before we could react, a series of hideous sounds erupted from the lake. A wet, guttural croaking followed by a deep, sucking noise, as if something colossal shifted in the muddy depths. Enormous bubbles burst on the surface, and the water, for a moment, seemed to boil black. Carl didn't think. with a roar of grief and fury, he launched himself into the black water, diving toward where the monstrous hand vanished. "Carl, no!" Sophia screamed, but it was too late. His head disappeared under the oily surface. Seconds dragged, eternal. The water went still again. Then, about 30 feet out, the surface churned. Carl surfaced, but not alone. He was being dragged. Something huge, an indistinct mass of shadow and pallid flesh, pulsing with a sickly green-purple luminescence, seemed partially wrapped around him. His arms flailed wildly, his face a mask of unspeakable terror. He screamed a single word, a word that made no sense then but would later sear my mind. "Ithilu!" Then, with unnatural force, he was yanked under. The water closed over him without a splash, only a black swirl that quickly dissipated, leaving the surface smooth as black glass. It was so fast, so brutally final. No struggle, just the inevitable suck of the depths. Panic seized us. We ran like cornered animals, stumbling on the dark sand, blinded by terror. Luke was hysterical, sobbing, clutching his arm where dark, almost black, sinuous streaks now pulsed beneath the skin. We reached the tents, sanity hanging by a thread. We had to flee. But the forest at night was an impenetrable tunnel of darkness. As we desperately grabbed our things, Sophia shrieked. Luke was gone. We searched frantically, flashlight beams stabbing the shadows. We found his dragged trail in the sand, similar to Isabel's, leading straight into the lake. At the water's edge where the marks vanished, his baseball cap floated, and beside it, one of the most vile things I've witnessed. A scale, but not a fish's. Large as my hand, black as pitch, but with an iridescent surface reflecting wrong colors, sickly purples and greens, in the flashlight beam. It felt like fossilized leather and stank of rotting fish and dank caverns. It was physical proof of the monstrosity dwelling below. Sophia and I didn't speak. We knew staying meant death. We grabbed essentials and fled into the forest, leaving everything behind. The woods were a living nightmare. Branches grabbed like bony fingers, roots tried to trip us, and the silence was now filled with whispers. Whispers from the trees, the ground, wet, wordless murmurs carrying malicious intent. We felt something following, something moving with a heavy, wet dragging sound, something smelling of ancient silt and decaying flesh. We didn't look back. We ran until our lungs burned and legs failed. Dawn found us staggering onto a backcountry road near Ellsworth, filthy, bloodied, eyes wide with a terror that would never leave. We told our story to authorities in Bar Harbor. Skeptical cops, rangers who gave the lake a cursory search. They found nothing, of course. Only deep, silent water. Isabel, Carl, Luke were listed as missing, presumed drowned or victims of animal attack. But I know. Sophia knows. Shadow Lake guards an ancient secret, one that should have stayed buried in layers of silt and forgotten time. The creatures, the deep ones as old fishermen whisper in tales no one believes, aren't legend. They are there. They sleep or wait, in the abyssal depths where sunlight never reaches, in a drowned city of non-Euclidean geometry whose black spires rise from primordial ooze. They feed. They call. That whisper in the woods, that stench of rotting fish and deep water, hasn't left me. Sophia moved inland, far from any large body of water. I try, but every river, every lake, even a large puddle after rain, makes me see vague, sinister shapes beneath the surface. I see Luke's eyes, no longer human, but large, black, and lidless, staring at me from dark waters in my nightmares. And the worst, what keeps me awake on moonless nights, is the memory of the word Carl screamed before being dragged down. Ithilu. Sometimes, when the wind blows a certain way over any lake, or when the night silence is too profound, I swear I hear a wet, guttural echo answering from the watery depths. They know I know. And a lake, any lake, is never just water again. It's a doorway. And on the other side, in the unfathomable deeps, something ancient and hungry awaits its next summons.